Okay, then we are ready to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ebba Boye, and I am the leader of Rethinking Economics Norway. And we are delighted to have David Ellerman here today.
Top. Hello.
And he has been here with a bunch of his colleagues all week. I've been following them around, listening to them speak, and it's been quite extraordinary, I have to say, and very inspiring. So you guys are very lucky to be here today. We also have people following in by stream, and welcome to you too. And I also want to thank Håkon Gran, who has made all this possible, and especially support of Bergesen-stiftelsen. David Ellerman, you work within the field of political economy, economics, philosophy, social theory, mathematical logic, quantum mechanics. I believe he's giving a talk about quantum mechanics at the University of Oslo tomorrow. His background is he's been working for a period in the World Bank, where he was the economic advisor for Joseph Stiglitz. He has his undergraduate degree in philosophy from MIT, and from Boston he has a master's in philosophy of science and master's in economics, doctorate in mathematics. He's been teaching, researching. He has a consultancy firm in Eastern Europe. And now he's working as a visiting scholar at the University of California and University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And he has written a number of books, and he's been working on this topic of the employee-owned firms for a long time. And we are very excited to have you here. So give him a big applause. And I also want to say that it hasn't been announced so well, but that we also have Kalle Mone, who is here, who will be giving a short comment afterwards. I will introduce you then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eva, and thank you for the invitation. The idea here is to focus on neoclassical economics and the heart of neoclassical economics insofar as it concerns the problem of distribution, the problem of labor. And so it's a extensive argument. I have a few slides here, and I hope the slides will be available like on your website or something, so people want to go more deeply into it, they can look at the slides. But the place we start out is this question of so-called question of distribution as it's posed in the neoclassical literature. And it is posed as a question of how do you price inputs? What is the right price, as it were, for inputs, taking labor as one of the inputs into the firm? And the sort of empirical fact that energizes a lot of this discussion is the obscene maldistribution of wealth and income, and which has just gotten completely out of hand historically. And so the big names in this, written about this recently, you may all be familiar with it. Thomas Piketty, Joseph Stiglitz, who I was his advisor and speechwriter for 3 years in the World Bank, James K. Galbraith, the son of Kenneth Galbraith, and Branko Milanovic, who was an old friend from Yugoslavia and was in the World Bank. So they all write about this maldistribution of income and wealth, but the problem is, what is their critique of neoclassical economics that it lies behind it? And that's what I want to talk about today. A critique which you don't find in their writings. And so the way in which the question is posed is this question of distribution. So you think of the whole pie here as the product that is produced, sort of Q in terms of the output Q with the unit price P. And then you want to say, well, how is this pie distributed between the factors of production? And so a certain part would go to labor, the wage rate times the number of units of labor, the capital rental rate times the number of units of capital, and then whatever's left over from this total revenue would be the profit here, or if you have the equation here. So this is the way the question is posed. There's a question of distributing the product or distributing the revenue between the competing factors of production. And it boils down then to how much do you pay for each unit of labor, how much do you pay for each unit of capital. So it's posed as a question of input pricing. And the standard theory of input pricing in neoclassical economics is the marginal productivity theory. So this theory arose in the late 19th century as a part of the marginalist revolution. And there was also a corresponding theory of marginal utility, but that's not as controversial. I mean, it's a lot of people criticize it for being unrealistic, but it doesn't address the question of production, the question of labor, and that's where all the controversy is focused, is on production of labor. So marginal productivity theory has been sort of the hardcore of the neoclassical way of addressing this question posed as the question of distribution. So here's John Bates Clark writing at the 1899, just at the turn of the century. And so the question is this, and notice he's talking about property, point in the economic system where the titles to property originate. So that means the firm, the enterprise, where capital and labor come into possession of certain amounts, namely what you pay labor and what you pay capital, amounts the state treats as their own. The social procedure is true to the principle on which the right of property rests. So here they're saying that the very idea of private property rests on a certain principle, and that principle is satisfied by this theory of distribution when inputs are priced according to marginal productivity. So I'm going to give you a bunch of quotes because neoclassical theorists like to say, well, it's not a normative theory. Well, no, it's not a normative theory, but they interpret it as being satisfying the normative theory that in some sense the inputs are getting what they produce. So John Bates Clark goes on and says, a plan of living that should force men to leave in their employer's hands anything by right of creation is theirs would be an institutionalized robbery, a legally established violation of the principle on which property is supposed to rest. And that principle is getting what you produce in effect. So that's Clark. Frank Knight, I highly recommend the works of Frank Knight. He was by far the most sophisticated apologist for the system we have of which is called capitalism, or that's actually a misnomer. And even Knight points out it's a misnomer. The real key to the system is the employment contract, the wage labor contract. But if you want to get the most sophisticated defense of the system, and then read Frank Knight. He's sort of the best antagonist to criticize the system. And a lot of the critiques come from the left of marginal productivity theory or neoclassical theory. Knight is fully aware of them and says that's not the point. And I'll give you examples later on. Milton Friedman has a book called Essays in Positive Economics. Positive economics means non-normative economics, but the way in which Friedman was not normative was to say, well, the system satisfies this principle. You may not like the principle, but that's just the way the system is. And he even calls it the capitalist ethic. The ethical principle that would be directly satisfy the distribution of income in a free market society. So this means in what economists call a competitive equilibrium. So a free market society which is in competitive equilibrium, to each what he and the instruments that he owns produces. And then in another book, this is in his famous book, Capitalism and Freedom. In another book, he wrote a textbook on price theory. The basic postulate on which the argument rests is the ethical proposition the individual deserves what is produced by the resources he owns. So there he's treating labor as a resource that an individual produces and is paid for. And then we go to John Rawls. So John Rawls is usually considered to be the major philosopher of justice issues in recent times. And when he comes to consider the marginal productivity theory, he identifies it with this idea. If you read the quote here, it appeals to the traditional idea of a natural right to property in the fruits of our labor. So he is not far from criticizing marginal productivity theory. He is identifying it with the idea of private property based on getting the fruits of your labor. And then he goes and criticizes it for a lot of other reasons, saying, well, markets are in fact not very competitive, so this pricing of inputs according to marginal activity theory, which only holds in perfectly competitive markets, would not hold. And even goes into the whole question of the prior distribution of wealth, owning capital and owning land, as if marginal productivity theory was supposed to account for that, which is based on conquest and robbery and all that in the past. So his criticism of marginal productivity theory was not of the theory itself, but of all these preconditions, the distribution of property goes into it, and plus the fact that markets are rarely competitive, and so you don't really get this sort of input pricing that the theory looks at. So this is the sort of way in which the issue is framed. And as usual, when there are fundamental questions, the real debate is not about the answers to the question. The real debate is about what's the framing. How are you framing the question? And you've got to frame the question. To really get a different answer, you need to frame the question differently. Marginal productivity theory is a very good answer to the question of framed in the way in which neoclassical economics frames it. So my critique has not to do with criticizing marginal productivity theory, but criticizing the whole framing where labor is treated as simply another input into the firm, how to price it as a commodity in the labor market. And a lot of the critique is based upon the fact that neoclassical economics is so mathematical, it's so unrealistic, the models are highly idealized, and so forth and so on. And as usual, Frank Knight got it right. He says that neoclassical theory is not intended to be a direct description of social reality. It's a certain logical construct where consumers act a certain way, firms act a certain way, they interact in a certain way, supply and demand in the market. And so this is one of my favorite quotes because he says that most of this criticism from the left about these, the way in which neoclassical theory is so unrealistic is irrelevant. It's a logical construct. It's like geometry. You know, in the real world, you don't find ideal circles. You don't find ideal squares in the real world, but you have geometry that deals with those ideals. And so Frank Knight is saying neoclassical economics, or this case, Chicago School economics, is based on idealizations. That's the whole idea. It's not supposed to be directly distributive in the sense maybe some sociological theory would be. So if you want to criticize it, criticize the ideal. Don't criticize the divergence between the ideal and the actual descriptive, very complex descriptive reality. So I'm going to develop a critique of the ideal, not yet another critique of, oh, it's unrealistic, it's mathematical, and it doesn't describe in detail social reality. Of course it doesn't. So, and my complaint about my colleagues, Stiglitz, Galbraith, I know the latter three, I don't know Piketty personally, and even Stephen Keen and even Rawls, is that they have no criticism of marginal productivity theory per se. They have no criticism of the ideal model. All their criticisms have to do with the uncompetitiveness of the market. There's rent seeking all over the place. There's rarely equilibrium and imperfections in information. If you talk to Stiglitz, that's his big thing. Measurement difficulties to even measure what marginal productivity theory is. I mean, all these things which never attack the theory as a mathematical construct or a logical construct, that this would be the ideal way to price inputs if you had all these things holding. So the critique I'm going to develop here is going to be different from that whole left wing sort of, it's neoclassical theory is unrealistic. So when you accept that framing, then the whole question of policy is, well, how do we make markets closer to that competitive ideal? How do we have antitrust policy to get more competitive firms? How do we regulate the markets to try to do away with the imperfections of information? How do we improve measurement of results in firms to estimate marginal productivity better, and so on and so on? So that's the orthodox framing, and thus the whole debate is, how do we make markets more like that ideal rather than critiquing that ideal itself? So before we get going on that, let me just settle some questions of terminology, which I think have some importance. The institution that we're analyzing specifically is the institution of wage labor, the institution, the employer-employee contract, the master-servant contract was the older language, and technically it is the institution of renting human beings. Now we have to sort of explain that a little bit, that in America we say we rent cars, but we hire humans, hire workers. Where if you just go to England, what's a rental car called in England? In England it's called a hire car. And so the words actually mean the same thing, but we're accustomed to only applying the word hire to cars or people, not the word rental, but it's the same thing abstractly. And so I'm not saying that the contract to rent a car and to rent an apartment are exactly identical, but abstractly, they are the same thing. You're buying the services of a car, you're buying the services of an apartment for a fixed time period, or you're buying the services of a human being. So technically the employer-employee relationship is the institution of renting human beings. We can't own workers anymore, we got to rent them. And that's the real difference with slavery is, number one, it's voluntary by any normal juridical standard. The employment contract is voluntary, and it's a rental contract. You cannot sell all your labor at once, which would be sort of the old, if you thought of slavery in terms of a contract, selling it all at once. So this use of language is not controversial. This is just, it's unusual. And I apologize if you haven't thought of it this way, but I'm quoting Paul Samuelson. Now, who could be more standard neoclassical than Paul Samuelson, where he says, since slavery was abolished, human earning power is forbidden by law to be capitalized. In other words, you can't sell the full stream of your future labor. Man is not even free to sell himself. So the voluntary slavery contract was abolished along with the abolition of involuntary slavery. It wasn't just that we abolish involuntary, the slavery contract, which was a real contract in law in a number of countries, including the United States, was abolished as well. He must rent himself at a wage, and the emphasis there is in the original text of Samuelson. This is Samuelson's primer. Just to give you another example, here is a quote from a textbook which says the same thing. The three authors are Stanley Fischer, who was chief economist of the World Bank, who was the number 2 man at the IMF, which is the highest an American can go in the IMF. Then he left the IMF and worked for Citigroup, and then he became the head of the Israeli Central Bank, and then he became the number 2 person in the American Federal Reserve System under Janet Yellen, and now Janet Yellen and Stanley have retired. And Dornbusch, who was a colleague of Fisher's at MIT, who died a long time ago, and Richard Smolensky, who was my roommate at MIT freshman year. So I think Smolensky may even be trying to stick it to me by using this language in the textbook. I don't know. So let's, first of all, analyze this picture of the pie in which each party sort of gets what it produces, and just say for a moment, well, what are the actual property rights? Not metaphorical. Metaphorical, we can talk about shares of the product, but what are the actual property rights in an enterprise, a normal enterprise run on the basis of the employment relationship? And the standard way in which neoclassical economics summarizes the results of an enterprise, I accept. It's a vector, it's a list where the negative components in the vector stand for the inputs that are used up, which need to be priced out. They become the cost or the expenses. And then the positive components in the vector are the outputs that are produced. So let's take the simplest of all cases, the Q equals F of K and L, the production function. So the production vector or input-output vector is Q, comma. So we're not adding, these are different things, we're not adding apples and oranges here. Q, comma, minus K, so that's the liability for using up the services of capital. So K is measured in machine services or land services or anything that's all the non-human inputs are sort of packed in under capital, and using up so much labor, thinking of labor as a commodity, an input that's used up in production. So I accept that as a description of the net or the total results in a productive enterprise, and for historical reasons, I'm going to call that the whole product vector. That's an historical term you may be familiar with, and divided into the positive product, which is simply the positive components of the vector, and the negative product, which are the negative components. So the negative components are the liabilities that you create in a production process. You got to use up all these inputs, and that creates liabilities, and it creates the question, who's going to bear those liabilities? That's the property question. The negative property on the negative side is who bears the liabilities, and then property on the positive side is who gets the output. So all property theoretic questions at the point of production should be thought of in algebraically symmetric terms. Who gets the liabilities? And of course, the party that gets the liabilities will also get the ownership of the product. And so in fact, one party will appropriate the whole product. The whole product is not distributed. So that's the first, right, the title of the paper, Mistakes and Metaphors. That's the first mistake. It's not a matter of the product being split between the parties. One party owns all that Q, and on the negative side owns all of the liabilities. And that party is who we call the residual claimant, who we call the firm, in effect, is that party. So the question of distribution is assuming the firm is somehow otherwise identified, and then saying how will that party that appropriates Q and is going to pay off those liabilities, how do you price those liabilities? How do you price the labor input or the capital input and so forth? So we are saying here that that is not the fundamental question. The fundamental question is not the question of distribution, but what some people call the question of pre-distribution, which is who's to be the firm in the first place. Capital, labor, the state, the entrepreneur, whoever. Who's to be the firm in the first place? So in property theoretic terms, that means who's the one that gets that whole product, that bears those liabilities and owns those outputs. And that's a different question, completely different question than the one of how do you price the outputs to sort of split up that pie between the various inputs of capital and labor. So this is a simple fact. This is not contested, really. I mean, nobody thinks that the workers in General Motors own part of the cars and the capital suppliers in General Motors own other of the cars. All the cars are produced by the corporation, and the corporation bears all those liabilities. So whoever the employer is in a typical firm appropriates this. Try to find that statement in any textbook in economics. I mean, just say, in order to get this sort of a undisguised description of the simple facts that the employer, the firm, the residual claimant owns all the outputs, they're not split, and all the liabilities, so we accept this vector of both. You got to go back to James Mill, for example, John Stuart Mill's father, who correctly lays it out. This is before people learned to speak nicely, and so they talked about wage labor and slavery sort of in the same breath. Being equally, however, the owner of the labor so purchased, this is purchased, piecemeal terms, as the owner of the slave is of the slave, the produce, which is the result of this labor combined with his capital, is all equally his own. So the manufacturer who works with rented people instead of owned people owns all the labor, owns the capital, or rents the capital. In other words, bears the liability for that minus K, and therefore Mill goes on to say, it is in these circumstances that almost all production is affected. The capitalist is the owner of both the instruments of production, in other words, having paid off those liabilities, and instruments of production means the services of labor, and the services are capital, because you can rent machinery. He doesn't have to own the machinery, doesn't have to own the building, but he has to own the services of the building or the services of the machinery, and therefore the whole of the produce is his. Now, try to find that statement in any neoclassical textbook throughout the 20th century. I'll buy you a free lunch if you can find it, and including the 21st century. To find it, I had to, Mr. Google's helped me out here, and so I put it in, and it turns out there was a sociologist in the 20s, Henry Fairchild, 1916, and Fairchild lays it out. So Fairchild, he hasn't been trained in the proper use of language as economists are, and so he just says what the facts are. There has been much querying about how much of the product belongs to labor. So that was that pie chart, how much goes to labor, how much goes to capital. These questions never bother the manufacturer or his employee. They both know in actual fact all the product belongs to the capitalist and none to the labor. The latter has sold his labor and has the right to the stipulated payment thereof. In other words, he's the recipient to that W times L, the rental, the wage payment. He has no more ground for assuming a part ownership of the product than the man who has sold the raw materials or the land on which the factory stands. So simple statement, and it is verboten in the entire literature of neoclassical economics to simply state these facts, because they give the lie to the way in which they want to frame the question is the distribution of that product in terms of how do you price those inputs, how much goes to labor and capital. So I'm saying the real question here is not the question of how to price inputs. The real question is who's to be the firm, who's to appropriate that whole product in the first place, the question of pre-distribution. And that's the question which an alternative theory will address. So I'm not saying we got a different theory, a marginal productivity theory, that labor should be paid some different wage rate. I'm saying the theory will eventually show that labor should not be a commodity input at all. It should not even be under that price regime of being bought. It should be the firm. So the alternative firm is the one in which the people that work in the firm are the members of the firm. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So try to find a single book. So we're really sort of redefining the question here. This is the normal question of distribution. How much labor should we get so that if that's equal to the wage rate, then L times that is how much goes to labor and similarly for capital and so forth. That's not the question. The question is this: who is to be the firm in the first place? Capital, labor, entrepreneur, the state. In other words, who is to be the appropriator of the whole product? And that is not a question of pricing. That's a question of property. So you need a theory of property if you're going to address this. So who should be the firm in the first place? And the answer to that question is what is traditionally called the labor theory of property, the theory that people have the right to the fruits of their labor. So I'll get a little bit, here's sort of the picture of the intellectual history here. So out of neoclassical economics, classical economics, you had Locke and Smith and Ricardo that had this sort of labor theory that was in the air, that somehow labor is different than other factors of production, as indeed it is, and somehow they had to take account of that. And so you had this idea of the labor theory of value lurking in Locke and Smith and Ricardo, and that was then developed fully by Karl Marx. And so that was the fundamental question, is how do you develop that labor theory? And Marx made the fundamental decision to develop it as a theory of value. And we know how that turned out. That turned out to be a train wreck. That turned out to be a complete disaster as a theory. Marx did a marvelous attempt to develop that theory. It turned out that necessary mathematics was not available until the mid-20th century in Leontief's input-output theory, so then they could formulate the theory mathematically and could see what it says, and what it says is very superficial. It basically was a theory about that labor input is underpriced, and for various reasons. I don't need to go too far into that. My point is that that's not the only way to develop that inchoate idea of the labor theory. It could also developed as a theory of property. And the people that did that are often called the Ricardian socialists, even though they were neither Ricardians nor socialist in the 20th century sense. And the names I would suggest are Thomas Hodgkin, English Ricardian socialist, or I would call him classical laborist, and wrote in the early half of the 19th century. And Proudhon was and so how does one discover that these people are doing the labor theory of property and not the labor theory of value? Well, one secret is to read the titles of their books. What was the title of Proudhon's main book? No, qu'est-ce que la propriété? What is property? Not what is value, which is what is consumed the Marxist tradition, but what is property? And the existing property system, Proudhon said, is theft, and that property needs to be purged by justice. So the attack is not on private property. The attack is on a system that abuses the principle behind private property, which is getting the fruits of your labor, which is the sort of rough expression of the labor theory of property. And similarly, if you look at Hodgkin's books was like the natural versus the artificial right of property. So this whole tradition that said, well, the whole issue is about value, the whole issue is about pricing of inputs, just ignores this other tradition that's been there all along, developing the labor theory of property. Just read the titles of the books and one can see that. So intellectual history was dominated by Marx, unfortunately, and who chose to develop the labor theory of value. And then towards the end of the 19th century, you had the Marginalist Revolution, where economists rediscovered calculus, rediscovered derivatives, and applied it to economic problems, and developed the marginal productivity theory and the marginal utility theory, and so forth and so on. But my point is that this alternative theory is there all along, but ignored and misinterpreted and so forth and so on. So what I'm doing here is basically developing a modern version of what Proudhon and Hodgkin and that early group tried to develop it in modern terms and precise terms. So it reframes the question not as a question of pricing of inputs or distribution in that classical sense, but as a question of jurisprudence. Property is a property and contract are questions in jurisprudence in general. And so I want to now shift a little bit over into that field, which takes us outside of economics as it has been defined in the 20th century to exclude these questions of property and contract in the sense of juridical theory. So just start off with a perfectly simple question. What is the fundamental notion of injustice? The sort of common example of injustice is where you have some guilty person committed a crime, but then was let off scot-free, didn't have the legal responsibility for the crime. And you can think of this as like a type 1 error in terms of statistics. And the other example of injustice is where an innocent person, factually innocent, was legally held responsible. So I have a little table here, which is copied out of Wikipedia, the source of all good knowledge these days. And it was a table for type 1 and type 2 error in Wikipedia, where this was the hypothesis either accepted or rejected, so something humans do, and this was the underlying factual question of whether the hypothesis was true or not. And so you had these two type 1 errors where the hypothesis was rejected, but in fact it was true. The type 2 error, where it was the other way around, the hypothesis was factually false, but was not rejected. So what I'm saying here is we can adapt the same sort of thing, because you've got two concepts, just as you have the question of whether the hypothesis, this human thing, is true or is not true or not, but is rejected or accepted, which is a human decision. And then you've got the underlying factual question, which is a question of fact. Is it true or not? Or is it false? And you have the same thing here. You have the legal responsibility, which is a human creation of the juridical system. And you have the underlying factual question of, well, did they in fact commit the crime? So you have two different types of injustice. The one here where the person was factually responsible for the crime but was not held legally responsible, so they're unjustly not convicted. And then you have the type 2 error where they were not factually responsible. In other words, they were innocent, but then they were held legally responsible. So we're making very simple. This is not a sophisticated theory we're talking about when legal and factual responsibility match. Then you have either the true positive, where the guilty person is convicted, or true negative, where the innocent person is held legally innocent as well. So nothing too difficult here. What's the underlying principle? The underlying principle is to get what is satisfied in the true positive and true negative. Well, that's where the legal responsibility is assigned according to the facts, to whether they're factually responsible. That's sort of the fundamental underlying principle of imputation, in German Zurechnung, and that's when the principle is satisfied. When it isn't satisfied, you get a mismatch, then you got the type 1 error, the type 2 error. So let's now ask that question about production. Let's apply elementary jurisprudence about production. So here's sort of a little chart of the sort of neoclassical picture, the firm taking these inputs in here and producing the outputs, but the inputs are not resold. The inputs are used up. So the property rights die. In other words, you have now, who's going to take the liability for those property rights dying? And new property rights are created to the output. So who has the ownership or the legal responsibility, as it were, for those outputs? And that's, of course, the vector I talked about before, the whole product vector, where this is the positive component and these are the negative components. So that's the question we want to take a look at from the point of view of elementary jurisprudence. Who has the factual responsibility for creating those liabilities and those outputs, and who has the legal responsibility? In other words, the legal liability for the inputs and the legal ownership of the outputs. So that is the question. So if you apply exactly the same principle to this question of production, this reframed question of production, then the result is pretty clear, that the people that work in an enterprise, labor in the inclusive sense, including managers, are the ones that are in fact responsible for producing the outputs and in the process creating the liabilities for using up the inputs, which means creating those liabilities. So in the second bullet there, I say the human beings who by their human actions called labor jointly use up the causally efficacious inputs capital. So there's no criticism here that capital is not productive. Of course it's productive. Why would people use it otherwise if it wasn't efficacious in increasing the output? But they are responsible for using that up in factual terms, and they thereby jointly produce the outputs. So all those people are the ones that by their labor produce Q and use up K. So one way to look at it is that this is the product of labor. That the taking the labor as the set of human actions performed by all the people in the enterprise, that's what they produce. They produce the output, or they use up the capital. So then you say, okay, what does the system give them credit for? And so this is what they produce, labor's product, but this is what the system gives them credit for, is labor as a commodity, and which they typically then sell. So the difference between what they produce and what they their property that was recognized is the difference between these vectors, where you, of course, you do the subtraction component-wise, is the whole product. So there is the institutional robbery that John Bates Clark talked about. This is what people produce but don't have the rights for, is this difference between labor's product and what they are recognized as owning, which is just their labor as a commodity. And that's the whole product. So basically what they're robbed of is not just the whole product, it's the firm, because that's who the firm is. The firm is the party that appropriates the whole product, that bears those liabilities and owns those assets. So that's the outcome of the labor theory of property implemented in modern terms. It's just the juridical principle of imputation. So we're not making up some crazy thing. We're taking ordinary bourgeois jurisprudence that assigns legal liability according to what the facts are. And the facts are the people in the firm produce the whole product but are denied the rights to it. And how that works out we can go into. What's the value of what they're denied? Well, you take the price vector and you multiply through times, take the dot product with the whole product vector, you get the profit. So the old result that precisely what in value terms people should get and don't is the profit. So to step back now, this is not an alternative to the marginal productivity theory as a theory of input pricing. We're not saying that workers should get their marginal product plus some extra thing. We're saying that's entirely the wrong question. The right question is the question of property rights. Who should be the one that ultimately bears the liabilities and ultimately owns the product? And the answer is, according to the normal bourgeois theory of jurisprudence, is the people that used up those inputs by their responsible human actions and the people that thereby produce the product. And that's the people that work in the firm, regardless of the legal superstructure. So The theory says labor should be the residual claimant. In other words, labor should be the one that gets the whole product. And this is why I use the language whole product, because there was, in those days, this slogan, labor's right to the whole product. And in fact, there's a whole book published in 1899 by Anton Menger, who was the brother of Karl Menger, the Austrian economist Karl Menger, called Labor's Right to the Whole Product, the history and development of this theory, and so forth. So we're not saying something new here in a sense. We're taking old theories that have been brushed aside by the domination of Marxist thought and the labor theory of value and resurrecting them in a modern form using ordinary jurisprudence, nothing fancy here, and justifying, as it were, this claim of labor's right to the whole product. And of course, I've said it 20 times, but the whole product includes the liabilities, because the normal thing is, oh, labor can't own the product, but somebody has to pay the cost. No, the costs are there. The costs are in the liabilities. So we're not neglecting that. So it's not a question of pricing labor. Labor should not receive any wage payment. Labor should be the residual claimant. Labor should be the firm, and thus get the net value added at the end, which in conventional accounting would be the wage plus the profit, net value added. So why is this argument not available? Well, you know why. It goes, first of all, conceptually, it goes outside of economics as it has been defined in modern terms, which excludes these questions of property and contract, and brings in the difference between human action, responsible human action, and the services of a thing. And marginal productivity theory is based upon treating ignoring the fact that human action has responsibility, is imputable, is Rechnungskeit, that you can impute responsibility to human beings, not to things. Things are causally efficacious, as are human actions, so they both have productivity in the sense of marginal productivity theory, but human actions have in addition this responsibility inexorably attached to it, and that is what gives you this alternative theory of labor's right to the whole product. In other words, labor should be the firm. So this is the metaphor, is that marginal productivity theory treats human actions as if they were simply the causal services of things, is one way to do it. Or the other way to do it is to treat things as if they were working alongside people and they cooperate together to produce a product. So Samuelson says, in lovely metaphor, that land cooperates together with the farmer to produce the corn crop. And so you're elevating land into something like a cooperating party, and they're both going to work together and produce a crop, or you treat them both as just sort of technologically as a causally efficacious input. Labor and capital or land are combined together, and somehow this product is produced, but not by anyone. And so that's the metaphor. Now, can we find in the history of economic thought where people actually understood this was a metaphor? And the answer is yes. You got to go back to before economists learned not to talk about the wrong things. So you have to go back to the very development of marginal productivity theory by an economist named Friedrich von Wieser, who was trained as a jurist, as Anton Menger was trained. So they were trained in law, but they were ones that developed the part of the Austrian school developing marginal productivity theory. So let's look at how von Wieser framed the question. This is it's a long quote, but the first part of the quote here says the judge, so we're talking now about legal imputation, who in his narrowly defined task is only concerned with the legal imputation, confines himself to the discovery of the legally responsible factor. So all factors are productive, but which factor is legally responsible? And he says quite clearly, this can only be persons. The person, in fact, who is threatened with the legal punishment, on him will rightly be laid the whole burden of the consequences, although he could never by himself alone, without instruments and all other conditions, have committed the crime. The imputation takes for granted physical causality. So when a neoclassical economist gets called in for jury duty, and the case is where somebody was murdered using a gun, does the neoclassical economist say, well, how much responsibility should we assign to the murderer and how much should we assign to the gun? You see, he doesn't. He then becomes a normal person who forgets his training as an economist and agrees that the legal imputation takes for granted physical causality. You can't blame the gun. You have to blame the person using the gun. And of course, if less guns were available, then you'd probably have less murders because they are very efficacious in committing murders and so forth. Then von Wieser goes on. These are pulled out of his book on natural value. If it is a moral imputation that is in question, then certainly no one but the laborer can be named. So what I call the labor theory of property is exactly what von Wieser is saying. Nobody but the laborer can be named. Land and capital have no merit that they bring forth fruit. They are dead tools in the hands of man, and the man is responsible for the use he makes of them. So he even has the negative liabilities, that the man is responsible for the minus K. That's even in there. So remember, what's the product of labor is the Q and the minus K. And here it is. So here is the sort of capsule statement of the labor theory of property by an Austrian economist before they learn to talk right, before they learn not to say things that are wrong, that don't support the system, just sort of blurt out the truth and accidentally. Okay, well, Orthodox economists have the social function to give a satisfactory account to the human rental system. So they live their whole lives in a system that takes totally for granted the renting of human beings. So you can be sure that they're not going to come up with any theory that would contradict that. If you go down to the antebellum South in America before the Civil War, try to find anybody who criticized slavery in the antebellum South. You got run out of town, tarred and feathered if you did. And now we have the same thing. We're not talking about owning workers. We're talking about renting workers. You don't find any economists that are going to, or any normal economists that value their position in the profession, that value getting tenure, that value getting published, and value being a part of that tradition that like Wieser can just state the simple facts. And as we've seen, the simple facts are that actually the laborer who has this responsibility, capital land being dead tools in the hands of man, yet labor has zero legal liability for the product, zero legal ownership of the product. And they are simply one of the liabilities for which the employer, or if you use the word capitalist, which I don't want to use, one of the people for whom the input is paid. So, so what is von Wieser going to do? Because von Wieser has stumbled on the labor theory of property. Von Wieser, if he continues to have his brain operate for 10 more minutes, will say, this is actually not the way the system works. So what am I going to do? Well, he does the only thing he could do. He says, well, this is the legal or moral imputation, so that doesn't apply. I got to create a new notion of imputation that will apply. We'll call it the economic. So here's his quote. In the division of the return for production, so now we're back to the pie, how we're going to divide up the pie, we have to deal similarly with an imputation, save that it is from the economic, not the juridical point of view. So this is then what feeds into the Milton Friedmans and John Bates Clarks and all the others that said, well, let's metaphorically talk about this distribution of the pie as if it was a type of imputation, and this is in fact the word that's used now in these days is imputation. Which part of the product can we impute to labor, which part to capital, and so Wieser then just ignored the actual legal moral notions of imputation and created this metaphorical notion of economic imputation. So what we're doing is simply saying, let's try to deal with science for once and not metaphors. Let's go back to the actual legal notions of imputation. Let's go back to the actual property rights assignments to the product and to the liabilities and apply the normal legal moral notion of imputation. And the result we get is that labor is the only one that can be named, that capital and land are dead tools in the hands of man, and the laborer is responsible for using up the services of capital and labor. In other words, labor should get the whole product. So that's the result of dealing with actual legal principles, not metaphorical ones, and actual property rights, not metaphorical ones. And we can even put this in another type 1, type 2 error. So here we're talking about responsibility for the whole product, factually, legally, and so the true positive would be that those who are factually responsible for the whole product, that would be the people that work in the firm, are legally responsible for it. In other words, they are the members of the firm as a legal entity, and those who are not factually responsible for the whole product will not be considered the members of the firm. And then the two types of injustice that occur when you get this mismatch are those that are factually responsible, namely the people that work in the firm, are not legally responsible, and those that are not factually responsible, in fact, get the legal responsibility. And we have a marvelous quote from a Tory conservative minister after the war, after World War II, 1944, Lord Eustace Percy gave us this quote. Here is the most urgent challenge to political invention ever offered to the jurist or the statesman. The human association that in fact produces and distributes wealth, workmen, managers, technicians, and directors, is not the association recognized by law. So what's he talking about here? He's talking about this case here, where the association that is factually responsible, that in fact produces, distributes wealth, is not even recognized by law, much less held legally responsible. And the quote goes on, the association which the law does recognize, the association of shareholders, creditors, and directors, is incapable of production. It's not expected by the law to perform those functions. We have to give law to the real association and withdraw meaningless privilege from the imaginary one. So if we go back to the table here, this is the legal party that is recognized and gets the legal responsibility, appropriates the whole product. It's not even possible for them to produce wealth because these are the shareholders, the absentee shareholders. So we get both the type 1 injustice, the people that do produce the product don't get it, people that don't produce the product do get it. And so you get both type 1 and type 2 injustice involved here in the firm based on the renting of human beings. And this is recognized by a Tory in 1944. So finally, so that's the argument by the labor theory of property, and reconceptualizing the way it's posed in neoclassical theory as this pricing of inputs to the prior question of predistribution. Who should be the firm in the first place? In other words, who should appropriate the whole product, and applying elementary bourgeois jurisprudence. It's the people that work in the firm do that, as von Wieser accidentally said way back. So now we turn to the alternative, so this is the firm where the people that work in the firm, where the type 1, if you go back here, this would be the true positive. The people that actually produce the product are the people that legally appropriate it. So they pay the liabilities that they create in the production process, and they own the positive product, the Q, in our simple model of that. And so this type of firm, variously called labor managed firm, worker cooperative, democratic firm, but the idea is the firm, the people, the legal entity, the members of the firm are, as Lord Eustace Percy said, the association of workmen, managers, technicians, and directors. They are the firm. Labor is the firm. So the firm, in political terms, would be a democratic community of work, and an industrial republic, We have a number of good examples of this. One of the better known examples of this is the Marginal system in the Basque Country of Spain. Another example is the Italian system of cooperatives in northern Italy, Reggio Emilia, and so forth. And there are other examples that are not quite as perfectly formed as worker cooperatives in America called employee stock ownership plans. And my two colleagues here, Chris Mackin and David Ertl, are better, can better explain the sort of practical side of this. So we should go to questions, and if you have practical questions, they can contribute here. I'm also here with Patrick Witkowski, who's a filmmaker at Matthias Göteborg, a lawyer helping us to look at these problems in Sweden. And Patrick has done a film on this whole issue called Can We Do It Ourselves? That just Google on Can We Do It Ourselves in YouTube. It's an hour-long film, was shown last night, and to describe these things in practice. So my part of the team here is to go back into neoclassical theory to put the finger on where neoclassical theory goes wrong, and it has nothing to do, the whole critique I've given has absolutely nothing to do with the wage rate, has absolutely nothing to do where workers are psychologically alienated, has absolutely nothing to do with whether they feel dominated, whether they're abused by their employer, blah, blah, blah. It has nothing to do with that. It goes into the fact that human beings are responsible for the results of their actions, and that does not change when they work in an enterprise. And another sort of intuition pump I could have used, I didn't have a slide on it, but the idea is what about when an employer-employee commit a crime, and then they suppose they're caught, and the judge says to the employee, well, you're liable for this as well, and the employee says, no, I sold my labor. I mean, come on, that wasn't my labor that committed the crime. I sold it. And so when John Locke says the turfs that my servant has cut from the common, the labor that was mine, having removed them from the common, have established my property right in them, Locke is using a pun. He's saying that the labor of my servant is my labor. So I'm getting the fruits of my labor that I bought from the servant. And the judge would say, of course, that's nonsense, that you cannot alienate responsibility like that, and so would just wipe out the labor contract with this contract which fraudulently pretends that responsibility can be transferred from the employees to the employers. The employer is the only one that produces the whole product. And the judge would ignore that and say, you're two responsible human beings. You decided, in one case you decided to make that decision. In the other case you decided to obey that decision. But that is your decision, and you're going to be held responsible for that. And that does not change when the action in which they cooperate together in is not criminous. Workers do not suddenly become machines that can be rented out when they're not committing crimes. They are just as much co-responsible, and I've spelled out the theory for you that traces out the consequence of that co-responsibility of all the people working in the enterprise, whether they're labeled employees or employers. They are together responsible for producing that whole product, and by the normal norms of jurisprudence, they should get it. In other words, labor should be the firm, not capital, not the state, as in the normal system or in socialism. So that's the argument. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. And now I am very happy to introduce our commentator on this talk, Kalle Mone. Thank you so much for coming, for jumping on your bike and coming down here on short notice to give some comments. Kalle Mone is an economics professor at the University of Oslo, and he leads the ESOP Center for Equality, Social Organization and Performance, which is very importantly not the same ESOP that might be talked about later today, which is the Association for Employee-Owned Companies in the US. So that's two different ESOPs. And Kalle has a long track record. I just want to mention that he has just started teaching a course in economic history at the University of Oslo, which our students, I hear a great thing about from the students. And well, we sort of hope that since Rethinking Economics Norway started saying we need more economic history, we need more history of economic thoughts, that hopefully we have created a demand among the students which resulted in this new course that I hear great things about. So I think that is something that we agree on. Another thing where I think the point where I believe you agree with David Ellerman is about the centrality of employee-owned companies. You have actually written 2 books about the topic some while ago, one called Alternatives to Capitalism and one called Marked uten kapitalisme, Market Without Capitalism. So we're very curious to hear what you have to say, both about the general comments on David's talk, but also especially we are interested to just hear your general views on employee-owned firms. So thank you.
Way too long introduction. But thank you in any case. It's he should be happy, David, so getting such a lousy commentator, because I basically agree to most of what he said. But to have some frictions, I will sort of impose some questions. I consider what you said as a sort of a theory about what should be the case, and look at the description of what should be the case. So there's a definition of discrepancy between what is normatively correct or justified.
Turn it on.
Men jeg snakker høyt nok, ikke det? Men, okay. Sorry. Did you hear what I said? Okay. So I take that as a starting point, that it is what should be the case. So we sort of summarize what he said with a halfway good joke, and there's some workers coming to the manager of the company, and they say that we're going to take over the place. No, you can't do that. The capitalist says, it's mine. This company is mine. Yeah, how come it's yours? And then they say, well, I inherited from my father. Okay, so how did he get the firm? And then he went, yeah, he inherited from my grandfather. Yeah, so you can't take this away. It's been property of our family. And your grandfather, how did he acquire the firm? I said he got it from the grandfather again. And then they went on. And in the end, they said that, yeah. And then there was this old man, and he fight for it. He said, so it's ours. So then the worker said, well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to fight for it now. And it is, in a sense, the essence of it. So who has the right to... because initially property rights were actually stolen property. But of course they accumulate and they get legal protection for the property rights in capital. And that is the essence of the story. I think for everybody who has been interested in labor-managed or worker-owned firm or democratic firms, the names change from person to person who use that. They easily understand this, that who has the right to the residual. And those who have the right to residual, if they run the company, they will also run it differently than if it is the capitalist who run it with a claim to residual. So my first comment is to what you said, is that your distinction between the labor theory of property and whatever the neoclassical theory, the distinction is only there if there is a pure profit in the system. If there is some surplus beyond the compensation for the rental price of capital, that must be the alternative use of capital where that can be used, and so if the workers have the property right in the firm, as you say they should have, and I agree to that, then there will be no descriptive differences unless there are something else, that they make different decisions, they have more motivation when they run the firm. if there's no pure profit in the sort of in the abstract sense that you described it, the pie in your, then there wouldn't be any difference. We'd like to hear your comments about that. Of course, that means, for example, if you take neoclassical economics at the face value, and nobody here does that, I understand that, then that means that it is the scale properties of the production function that really determines whether there's going to be any difference or not. Because if there are what Marx called, you can have extended production in the firm, that means that the scale elasticity of the production function is equal to 1. That means that if you double all the inputs, you double the output, then there can't be this pure profit in the system. The profit is the compensation to capital in that case. Your pie in that system, I know that you know this, will be 0. So there must be, to get the difference of the labor theory of property, there must be something that it affects behavior, motivation, trust also. And I think it does, and I think you think it does, and I think your friends traveling with you, we have seen that, for example, productivity in the Mondragon cooperatives that were showed here, there's a sort of between 10 and 12% higher than the productivity similarly defined in similar companies in the Basque province, but also if you compare to more distant enterprises, they have higher productivity, better motivation, they stay for longer, they have lower unemployment rates, actually have basically 0 layoffs in these companies because they are the friends, and there's also an economic reason for it. They have to compensate people if you lay them out. So that means that it's much more expensive for the remaining persons than when you have to compensate those that you lay off. So I think there must be, to really get something that's in addition to, I think that you have a very nice and a clear and logically super normative theory of who should be the residual claimant or the labor theory of property. But where it really, to get, I think there's more to the story, namely that if that were applied, then you would also expect motivation and behavior of humans operating under those circumstances to differ from what you know. So that's my first question. It is more connected to sort of it really applies to cases with pure profits, or some people call it rents. There are different names for these things. I may be using wrong terms for your purpose, but I think you understand what I'm saying. So that's my first question. So my second application is this. It is a strong implication of this who has the right to the residual profit in the enterprise, in the sense that if you're going to buy out, if you are as a group of workers going to buy out the present owner, you can do this with huge benefit if you don't have to compensate the present owner for his future profits, his future pie. If you have to compensate him for the profit that he would have earned under the protection of property that power gives to him in society, then you can't do better than he did, because then you have to compensate him for the profit that he would have taken if he had been there in the future. So then it's the only reason why it can be profitable for the group to have a buyout of the existing owners is that you get a higher productivity, you get a change in the behavior of the firm when you take it over. Otherwise, you have to do exactly the same as he did, because when he ran the enterprise, he maximized profits, and you're going to compensate him already now when you buy the firm. So there's a very clear prediction of that. There's no way you can have a profitable or beneficial takeover of the firm when you compensate the present owner for his future profits. So there's very clear implications of what David said. I may return to some a little bit more on labor management, but I have two sort of more history of thought things that we're just going to ask, and these are really questions. I don't know the answer about them myself. But if you look to the writings of Beatrice and Sidney Webb, they had more of a sort of property rights theory of the firm, in the sense that they treated labor just as you have sort of just as if it were land of different quality, and you have the right to what labor created in that sense. And of course, they draw different conclusions from it. They draw the conclusion that you have to have a strong union movement, and you have to have strong social democracy in order to back up these things. But there is some connection there. Question mark, I ask you. At least these, I think Sidney and Beatrice Webb are highly underappreciated. They were actually the founders of London School of Economics. If anybody have been students there, that they are the guilty persons. They were very radical. They ended up, unfortunately, I sort of defending the Soviet Union, and they moved to the country, but, which is not my favorite place on the planet. But they defended. So that's so this connection to that school, sort of they were not at all neoclassical economists, in my view. Neither of these. I think Beatrice Webb was really the brainy. I'm gonna. Okay. Okay, so that was one thing. Another one, and this guy, I think some people here would classify as neoclassical. I'm not so concerned with it.
Can we keep it up? I would like to refer to.
So here's my last question, or the second. That is, the book by, he has many books, but John Römer wrote a book called A General Theory of Class, A General Theory of Exploitation and Class, I think it's called. Where he sort of, that is what went into the garbage bin in one of the slides of David, the Marxian theory of exploitation. But he has a very different take on the whole thing. So he considered it as, he defined exploitation by by sort of seeing whether you can do better if you withdraw from society and create it your own. And of course, the answer to that question is how much property can you take with you when you withdraw from the present society, and you want to create your own. If you can do better by withdrawing from society and running your own thing, say running your own labor managed firm, then you're exploited in that sense that you work under conditions where you have a boss, a capitalist boss, and you are exploited in that situation. If you can withdraw and do better in an alternative, then you are exploited in the present situation. It is connected to your theory in the sense that this matters a lot. How much, what you can bring with you when you withdraw to alternative situation in the world, and again it is a because it depends on who has the right to the property of the firm, and then you have a behavioral measure of some of the same things, that then you do the best out of the new situation, bringing with you, for example, should you bring the average skill level in society in this alternative case? Should you bring your share of the capital? And most likely you should do that. So I think there is a connection there, and I think in this audience, people here will call John Römer for the neoclassical Marxist, but I don't care so much about these notions. I think it is the content, and I think you have a very good content in what you are saying. I think you can talk about the justice of labor-managed firms even without your clarification, but it is better. It can be better done after the clarification than before, and it is easy to understand the justification of it. What people very often forget, that the employer is the boss in normal circumstances in the neoclassical world or whatever, but it isn't because he is the employer. It is because he is the capitalist. It is because capital in our society has this backing, the power backing, that you have a claim to make the decision, and you have the claim to the residual, and that what is create the capitalist, the boss, this play on words, I think, was the Marx who was the first who said. Okay, I think I stopped there. I hope there are going to be some discussion on labor-managed firms, because there are some prominent guests here that at least I'd be very interested to discuss both that and further issues on. Should I take this off?
You can just keep it on.
Okay.
People have questions for you. Please, you mute it, please. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, David, would you like some quick responses before we open up from the audience?
You bet. Neoclassical theory needs to have some way in which it can avoid talking about the real problems, and for example, who gets the whole product, who appropriates the whole product. And one way to try to avoid that question is to take this sort of fairy tale case of where the whole economy is in competitive equilibrium at a point on the production function of constant returns to scale, whereby Euler's theorem, it then follows that the whole product has zero net value. And the argument I gave was never about value. I mean, it was perfectly clear all along that the argument was about property, and it didn't matter whether the value of the whole product was negative, positive, zero, or whatever. I never used prices in the whole argument. And so the argument is a property theoretic argument, and this whole ruse about saying, well, if we take the pinpoint case of all firms are in competitive equilibrium, the whole economy is competitive, and it's a point of constant returns to scale, then it won't have any value. Therefore, we don't even have to talk about that whole thing. And of course, so that's just a way of avoiding the question. I do not use any argument about the assignment of the residual. I talk about the assignment of the whole product. And it's a property theory, not a theory of value of the residual, who should get that, and so forth. So that's simply a common way to avoid talking about the property theoretic questions. And of course, I mean, it's easy to also say, well, what about control? I mean, you're giving zero value to the control rights, because that also switches in the labor-managed firm. And if neoclassical economists really believe, as you read the text, it makes no difference whether labor hires capital or capital hires labor, well, go tell that to the capitalist. Go tell that. It doesn't matter, if labor hires capital, and they'll get kicked out on their butts. And so they know better. It's like that quote from the sociologist: the employer isn't taken in by all these metaphors. The employer knows what the deal is. And to say that it makes no difference whether labor hires capital or capital hires labor because there's this one fairy tale pinpoint state, it has the whole product, the production vector has zero value, I mean, is quite irrelevant. So it's a way in which to avoid talking about the property theoretic questions in which the value of the residual plays no role. Number two, I've written down here, price in, what was your second point, Carl? Somehow I yeah, that was the third point. The second, oh yes, thank you. This is a very interesting point, and it has to do with the failure of the left in even understanding the system in which they're supposedly criticizing, and the capital theory controversies. You had the Cambridge controversy about capital theory and so forth, which dealt with wholly ancillary questions about when you have streams of income in the future that go up and down and you get reswitching and so forth. And the fundamental problems in capital theory were totally ignored in that debate. And the fundamental problem in capital theory is that the future profits, pure profits, are discounted back into the value of the capital, as if they were owned by the capital. And that is simply a misunderstanding of the capitalist system. I'm sorry, the future profits depend upon, this is what's called goodwill in accounting terms. The goodwill is not owned by the present employer. Goodwill depends upon the actions of your suppliers and the actions of your customer in the future. And if for whatever reason, the customers go elsewhere, the suppliers go elsewhere, and so forth, you will not get that value. And if you really had a present property right to that value, as it is presented as if you do in capital theory, then you could sue them for taking away, your value, your property. But you don't. The firm does not own the future whole products. That depends on whether capital hires labor, labor hires capital, what consumers do and what producers do, all in the future. So the fundamental mistake of capital theory is to capitalize the future pure profits into the value of the capital. Of course, the future rentals on capital should be capitalized into the value of the capital, and that's the basic theorem. It doesn't matter whether you buy the capital or you rent it throughout time, because the discounted present values of all the rentals, net of maintenance, should be equal to the value of the capital. That's not the controversial part. The controversial part is this idea that goodwill is owned as a present property right, and it is not. It is an anticipation of future property right. It's an anticipation that the customers will be well behaved and the competition will be well behaved, suppliers will be well behaved, and you will get that in the future. And even accountants understand this. Even accountants, because that is why you cannot put goodwill on the balance sheet as an asset. And then you have these transactions where you actually pay more for the net assets of a firm than the price. And the price is higher than the net value of the assets of the firm. And then the accountants say, well, this is purchase goodwill. And purchase goodwill you're allowed to put on the balance sheet as an asset, and then you depreciate over time. Well, how did the fact that you paid more for the assets than they're actually worth meant that you anticipated getting this profit? Well, that's fine, but that doesn't create a property right now that doesn't exist before. If I go out and buy, we have this joke in America of the country rube comes to New York and a guy says, how'd you like to buy that Brooklyn Bridge? And $100 you can own that bridge. Oh, that's a good deal. I'm going to buy the bridge. Well, the guy didn't have the property right to the Brooklyn Bridge to sell to you, and you don't have now the property right to the future whole products whose net present value is this goodwill. So if you pay more for it, you're not creating a property right. You're just creating anticipation that you'll get that. And so if you read the accountants that actually think this through, and I'm talking about accountants, they say that purchase goodwill should not be accounted for as an addition to assets, but as a subtraction from equity. And then you add it back to equity over time if, in fact, those profits are realized. So that is the fundamental error in capital theory, is to think that these rights are there. And Carl is perfectly correct. If you have the workers paying for that as if the seller owned, he may have a bargaining position where he can hold you up for that and 10 more things, but those are not property rights. Those are not property rights. Those are anticipated that I will get those property in the future by being the residual claimant in the future, but that depends upon a whole set of contracts, and you don't own the behavior of the future customers, you don't own the behavior of the future suppliers, and so forth. So those are not present property rights, and the workers should not have to pay for them when they do an employee buyout. So Carl was correct, saying that that would be a problem if they did, because that's not what you're buying. You're buying the net assets of the firm. Okay, and your third point was about the Webbs. Well, I didn't know this about the Webbs. I always thought the Webbs were considerable critics of worker cooperatives and great supporters of consumer co-ops. And I'll have to reread the Webbs if that is considered relevant here. And okay. Yeah, the Webbs are classical Fabian socialists, and whereas the people talking about worker ownership were guild socialists. So the firms are like the medieval guilds run by the people working in them. But that's an interesting remark. John Romer I don't want to waste too much breath even talking about him. We've, of course, clashed in the past. And at one point, the Review of Radical Political Economy in the States had a policy, rather than double-blind refereeing, they had double-sided refereeing. So you knew who your referee was, and he knew whose paper. So I submitted a paper on basically labor theory of property and worker control and all that. And John Romer was cited as was the referee, and he said that Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao saw through all this stuff about worker self-management and saw that it was logically contradictory, and therefore this paper is crap and should be rejected. And the editors accepted that review, and I resigned from the ERPI, Union of Radical Political Economy. So John has learned to control his Stalinistic tendencies over time, and has found new ways to hide them behind luck egalitarianism and so forth. But his contribution, I would be glad to go over the math with you and show you how it's really empty of any real content, and not to mention moral value. So the last point you made was about this idea that the right of the capitalist, the employer, to the product and to the control of production is attached to capital. This is actually incorrect. This is a misdescription of the capitalist system. It's a misdescription that goes back to Marx. I mean, Marx is the one that popularized it the most. And it goes back to the theory in the Middle Ages where the lord of the land automatically was the governor of the people that lived on the land and automatically appropriated the fruits of their labor. So this was all part of the medieval notion of dominion. So the landlord was the lord of the land, and the ownership of land was mixed together with the governance rights and appropriation rights. And Marx took that notion and simply transferred capital in place of land. And that is an incorrect description of how the capitalist system operates. I made the same mistake, I'm sorry to say, in my first two publications, where I thought those rights were attached to capital and I lambasted against it, but they're not. That's simply an incorrect description. And it's very easy to see because capital can be rented. Think through the consequences of the fact that capital can be rented. So you had no rental of land in the Middle Ages, so this system could survive. But if land had been rented, then it would be clear that the owner of the land is not the one that's governing the people that are using the land who have rented it. It's the same with capital. So one just has to think through the consequences of renting land. And fortunately, we have a nice example that Chris has dug up, where Studebaker Packard, in their declining years, this is a car company in America, and Packard's auto bodies were produced by another company, Briggs Auto Body Company, in Detroit. And Briggs, the old man Briggs, died, and his family didn't want anything to do with it. So they wanted to sell lump sum the entire Briggs company, which 12 factories altogether, including this one producing the auto bodies for Packard. And they sold the whole thing to Chrysler. So Chrysler owned these 12 factories. So then Chrysler had the choice of, well, do we kick out our competitor Packard and not allow them, to continue producing it, which would create sort of a scandal among the entrepreneurs and the owners of the auto business. And Chrysler said, no, we will lease you the factory. So for several years, Chrysler leased this 12th factory to Studebaker Packard, which was then one corporation. You can look it up in the Wikipedia. Source of all, look up Studebaker Packard, Studebaker basically, and look up Briggs Engineering Company. And so I asked my friends that believe in this idea that the management rights and the product rights are attached to capital. Here was a whole factory owned by Chrysler. So who owned the auto bodies rolling off the assembly line in this factory owned by Chrysler? Who had the managerial control rights over the workers in this factory owned by Chrysler? Not Chrysler. Studebaker Packard owned the auto bodies because they leased it. So they rented the capital and they had the managerial control rights. So by simply considering the fact that capital is rentable, the fact that it didn't hold for land in the Middle Ages, means Marx made a terrible mistake. The whole name capitalism, the name of his book, all that is a mistake. It's not capital substitute for land. The key institution of the system we live in is not private ownership of capital. It's the renting of human beings.
Thank you. Can we now open up for the floor? Great. So just let me know if you want to have, and I think our speakers have already spoken a lot, so I have to ask you to have brief, rather brief comments. Yeah, we'll start with Eric Reinert.
Thank you. I thought this was a very interesting, fascinating story, and I think you're touching on something which is crucial weak point in our system. And when we see it now, when the communist threat is over, Ricardo is wrong in his trade theory, but I think he's wrong that actually the natural wage level is subsistence. Why should he pay anybody more than he needs to show up for the job on the next morning, right? So I think we have a problem here, and I was fortunate enough to work with Jaroslav Vaniek, who is the father of the idea of the labor managed systems, and I even went to Peru, and my first publication was upon this, and you know, I found that you put the labor theory of value in a dustbin correctly, but that was a very English idea. You know, most of what Marx did wrong was what he got from Ricardo, I think is right. And Nietzsche has this term called Geist und Willenskapital, which is the spiritual and will capital, that there actually is an initiative out there. And that initiative is, we could call it entrepreneurship, right? And I think we should understand that you know, especially in the beginning, you know, the owners actually, it's not the capital, it's really the Geist und Willenskapital. And I think if you look at the success of labor managed systems, labor managed companies, it's where this function has expired, where it has been done, and it's a going concern. And the bus company in Lima was a great success. You know, the plywood factories in the United States. So I think the question is, if we recognize this, that, you know, Henry Ford was an important person, but, you know, how about Henry Ford's great-great-grandson? So if we say that there is an initial need for the spiritual and will capital, how can we introduce that and get the system to work? That would be my question. But you know, I agree with you. The Mondragon and these examples are fantastic. But I think this was Vaniek's weakest point, and he admitted it. And the question was what should we do with it?
Thank you. I haven't seen any other hands, but I was asking, maybe we can ask our friends from Scotland or US or Sweden to now maybe go a little bit into the more practical sides of the employee owned firms, and just hear a little bit about, I think, you want to hear? Okay. David.
The interesting, several interesting points here. One is, remember I said that Frank Knight is by far the most sophisticated defender of this human rental system. And Frank Knight explicitly says that capitalism is a misnomer. And it's very unusual for that Marx got it wrong. And he's talking about Marx. He says Marx misnamed the system. It's not based on capital. And these rights are not attached to capital. Capital can be rented. I mean, and the entrepreneur in the traditional figure rented both capital and labor. And so the argument about the entrepreneur does not change the labor theory of property. The creativity and initiative and risk-taking behavior of the entrepreneur is very real, I agree. But it doesn't turn everybody else into a machine. And so the question is, in practical terms, is how do you incentivize firms, entrepreneurs who do make a great contribution to getting the firm going and organizing production and bringing the product to fruition and so forth, and at the same time not violate the rights of the other people that we talked about. And it's a practical question that I recognize the practical problem. Frank Knight, of course, would say, well, everybody else is basically a machine compared to the creativity, the Geist of the entrepreneur. And Israel Kirchner is another example today of someone who has a whole theory idolizing the entrepreneur. And so they're like Ubermensch, also connected to Nietzsche, the Ubermensch, that everybody else is just a tool in their hands. And that's slight overstatement, but that's what the business press likes to read. The business press ignores the fact there were a few other people in Apple than Steve Jobs, and a few other people in Microsoft than Bill Gates, and a few other people today in Tesla than Elon Musk, and so forth. So that recognition doesn't change the fundamental argument I'm giving here, but it does point out that firms don't arise out of nothing, and I should say the same thing. This has been a traditional problem in political theory. So in political theory, democracies don't arise out of nothing. They rise out of revolutions against an older political order. And when you have a revolution against an older political order, then you have some hero of the revolution. And so who was the hero of the American Revolution against the British monarchy? Well, George Washington. And there was a whole movement at the time to make him a king, to make George Washington a monarch. And there was a movement by the officers' corps in the American Revolutionary Army to start a hereditary sons of the revolution, which would be, of course, an aristocracy in total effect, if not name. And George Washington was educated enough, had internalized classical civic republicanism enough that he recognized the danger. And he said, I will not even think of that possibility. And so there's a slogan in American history that says the greatest act of George Washington was to walk away after his serving as president and return to Mount Vernon, not to be made a monarch. And the classical example of this was, of course, Cincinnatus in Roman history, where Rome had this threat, and Cincinnatus had his farm. In the traditional pictures, it was with his hand on the plow. I think it was probably a slave's hand was on the plow. But anyway, he left the farm and led the Roman troops, defeated the enemy, and then could have become the emperor, but said, no, I will not corrupt the Roman Republic, and return to the farm. And so George Washington had all this in his head, and that's why he returned to Mount Vernon, his farm. And of course, the officer corps knew this too, so the officer corps wanted to recognize that, but still create it. So they created a thing called the Cincinnati Society and made Washington the honorary head of it. And Washington said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to play this game. We're going to create a republic and not a monarchy. And so you get the same thing in every single firm that is created. Is all firms start off as worker collectives. I mean, a few people get together, and then they make the decision of, well, do we at some point shut off? We're the members of the firm. We get all the shares, and everybody else is an employee, and thus they've decided, in effect, to create a monarchy. And so we need democratic entrepreneurs that will create a firm where they get a decent return, and we have to figure out how to structure that. And we have some ideas Chris can talk about, but it'll become a worker managed firm over time, and yet the entrepreneur will not be just giving up his creativity or his ideas and product and so forth. So
please come forward and fund the Cincinnati Society for Entrepreneurs of Oslo. It's like where entrepreneurs can go and be and can retire and speculate about these things and hand over ownership and control of their businesses to their employees. I'm more than half serious about that. I mean, the ways in which the business press, makes you want to take genetic scrapings from Elon Musk's, lunch, is crazy. I mean, this idealization, this valorization of entrepreneurial essence is sickening. And there are undoubtedly entrepreneurs who believe that themselves, who are embarrassed by the attention they get, and who are dignified people who want to do the right thing. Well, there needs to be a place for them to get together and reckon with that and have those conversations and be rewarded for the work that they've done but find a way to, like George Washington did, of passing the torch to the people who make it possible every day. So that's just in case there's any rich people in the room. That's
Well, Chris, describe the warrant idea.
Oh, I'm just gonna give the microphone to the lady over here, and I hope also that we can maybe end on a note, Chris, if you can say a little bit about the success of the employee-owned firms in the U.S., because I think it's nice to sort of get out of this is not some utopia and see how it actually works. So we'll end on that note.
Hello, I'm wondering, back to your theory. You are a professor and you own your intellectual property, but you will still not say that you own the whole product. How do you fit in intellectual property? Because artists, for instance, have intellectual property for their work, as professors have.
I'm not sure what the point is, that the right of authors to the product is recognized in copyright law, and some inventions or new ideas are part of a collective effort, and so they're owned by the company as part of the product, and we're talking about who should be the company, the people that work in it. Sometimes you have individual patents where they, as it were, pierce the corporate veil and give a specific person a patent right, but if I mean, the real violation is really in the employment firm, where the people that create a product are just employees and have none of those rights. The company has the rights, and that's the real violation, it seems to me. And I'm not sure I caught the sense of your question, though. Speak louder. You have the microphone.
Okay. Because you don't pay any costs, so you are employed by the university. You are not if you don't have enough money earned by your publications, you still got your earnings, but in addition to that, you get to keep your intellectual property. Well, how do that fit in? You said the whole product, and that included liabilities and it's both risks and gains. And how would that be for when you have this mixture of intellectual properties and employment and wages?
I mean, the applying the theory to the university would mean that the management of the university, the member of the university, should be the people that work there, which includes the professoriate and the staff and the students in some sort of a temporary sense, that they're sort of members for 4 years or whatever it is. And then if the patent was, you have the choice then of the patent can be seen as an individual right, if in some sense it really was, or it could be seen as a result of a collective research effort in which many people in the university contributed using the resources of the university and so forth, and then it would be owned by the whole. But the real injustice is when the university owns the rights and the people in the university are not the members of the university. They're the employees of the university. So this theory of democratization of work applies to nonprofits as well as for-profits. That has nothing to do with the question of democratic control of work, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit like a university.
Thank you. We have one more question here.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the practicality of, for example, what percentage of the firm should I receive as a, for example, a number of percentage of stocks in the company that I would start to work in. I mean, what would be the Yeah. That's my first part of the question, and the second is, wouldn't at least some of this be possible to accommodate by just paying workers in shares, if the company is a listed share company?
In your first part of your question, are you talking about the entrepreneur or an ordinary worker?
For example, if I start working at the company owned by a couple of entrepreneurs, so they own the whole company, and then
Right.
I come in to the company. So what would be the appropriate portion of the company that I would receive as a new worker?
Well, I mean, Chris will tell you about the sort of the most successful structure of this form in the United States, and part of our role here is to try to bring these ideas, very practical ideas that have been pioneered for 40 years in the States. Take it over, Chris.
All right. Hello. All right. So let me see if I can try to answer the young man's question. You seem to be talking probably more about a startup situation, and you're the third or fourth person in, and does that mean you should automatically get shares? Is that your question?
Well, I mean, you could ask the same question if you're the person.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it would be easier to answer that question than the first one, because all right. So maybe this is the way to talk about this. So there are 5 ways in which employee ownership happens, and it happens to give you the widest possible lens on this. It's happened in Argentina, and the turn of at 1999-2000, when the economy broke down and workers occupied factories. They literally just said, "You've closed the factories on us. We need those jobs. They support our families." They took the chains off the fences. They went in. They occupied the factories. They restarted them. Many of them have worked well, and they had to come to some agreement with the court, with the judge, about how to compensate the owner of the land and the buildings for those things. That is one way this happened in our lifetimes. It's not the most strategic way to think about this, but to give you a sense, because we're talking about how this actually happens in the real world. A second way is when you have groups of people who want to just decide these are the values that they have in common. They want to start businesses that are going to be owned by them and their friends. They don't want to be a boss. They want partners. That's generally their ethic. Those are people who have started cooperatives, mostly around the world. People who have those kinds of values, and you have some of that tradition here in Norway, I'm sure. The Marginal cooperatives are the most substantial example in the Basque Country of Spain. You should check that out. It's a 60-year story about how it got from 0 to 125 firms, 80,000 workers with their own bank and their own R&D center and so forth. It was because people had a vision and values, and they stuck to them, and they grew and they grew and they grew. The third way in which this happens is when unions negotiate ownership in exchange for some kind of concession with their employer. There may be in some kind of a distress situation. The employer says, "We need a break on your contract because we can't pay that right now." The union, if it's thinking well and sharply, says, "Okay, we'll give you that break, but we want the equivalent value in shares of stock, and we want seats on a board of directors." That happened in the steel industry in the United States. That happened at United Airlines in the United States. Is likely to happen in other situations in Europe, which we could talk about. The fourth way in which this happens, and is the most statistically significant starting point for this, is when owners of closely held businesses, family-owned businesses, privately held businesses that have not shared ownership, by when they've grown the business. They've grown it from their garage up to 200 people, let's say. They reach the age of 65 or 66, and they're saying, "Oh, I need to cash out because I want to retire, and my kids don't want the business," which is the natural inheritance thing. They've got to sell the business. And how we have a substantial topic to talk about, not just in terms of abstract theories in the United States, is that we have laws that were passed in the United States that create a legal trust structure to which workers and managers can join, and that trust can go to the bank and borrow money to be able to buy out the founder without workers having to go out of pocket at risk to be able to do this. And so sellers of these closely held businesses, let's say of 200 people each, many of which you've got outside of Oslo, have all of a sudden another alternative. They can sell internally to their people. Now they have to agree to do it, because guess what? It's going to be the assets of the firm that are going to be collateral on those loans. So if that's going to happen at all, they probably have to have some kind of a sweetener as to why should they sell internally to their people, given that they're taking on this extra risk. Well, in the United States, we make it possible for them to not have to pay capital gains taxes if they choose that alternative. So something of that order, something of that kind could be considered here in Norway. We were up at Parliament yesterday talking to some people about those ideas. Perhaps that's part of the future of how your family-owned businesses might be able to transfer ownership. The last way, the fifth way, which my friend David Ertl is the expert on, he's reminded me on this trip, is when people have founded successful large operations, have made lots and lots of money, and have decided for legacy reasons that they're going to gift the business to the employees on the way out. And John Lewis Partnership, the large retail chain in Waitrose, the supermarket division of that, is the largest such example in the UK. There are other examples that have done that. In those situations, it's a somewhat similar legal trust structure that holds the stock, in that case, usually in common, like in a foundation. There's no individual shares that the workers have, but people do get profit shares to have some kind of economic sharing that mimics what we call employee ownership. So those are the five ways it's happening. And David, maybe if you want to add something. So, in the U.S., you did that for me yesterday. Maybe you should do it. There's 7,000 firms, 12 million workers have done this in the United States. And actually part of what I'm also an investment banker, strangely enough. And I'm trying to raise a $300 million fund that will advance this process of workers and managers being able to buy their firms from the sellers. Because one of the reasons there aren't 15,000 or 25,000 companies as opposed to just 7 is that while there's a tax incentive that exists in law to make this attractive to sell internally, no bank is going to loan 100% of the value of a company. And so these 7,000 companies have become employee-owned slowly, usually with 30% 5-year loans, another 30% 5-year loan, another 30% 5-year loan. So your sellers have to be particularly patient people. They might be getting this tax incentive, but they're going to have to wait to get all of their money out. So what is needed in this country, in every country, and we're trying to do it in the United States, are large capital pools, private equity-like capital pools that will back workers and managers and write the higher risk equity check that is necessary to make these transactions happen, with confidence that these firms are professionally conceived and being run and are going to make money, are going to pay back that loan, and to generate a return, a market return for investors. So that's also what needs to happen. David.
Thanks. Just a very quick word about one or two European examples. These companies can be tremendously successful, and they are characteristically more successful, more productive than conventional companies. In Italy, the oldest one that I know about is 1874. It became a workers' cooperative in 1874, and it continues to be an extremely successful tile manufacturer, with exporting all over the world from the original base, and it's still a workers' cooperative. Now, one of the reasons why companies can continue for a very long time, or one thing which helps them do this, is to have a substantial collective element which gives them stability. So you're saying, how many shares do I get? Well, you should get less than all of them between all the employees. So the Italian cooperatives characteristically have about 30% as a collective. In Mondragon, it's similar. It's a similar sort of proportion. The Spanish cooperatives. The next longest one that I know of is Carl Zeiss Stiftung in Germany, the lens manufacturer, the optical manufacturer, which is extremely successful, a very large company. That's been in employee ownership since 1891, and that is an example of pure gift. How it was set up, as was the Italian one. The very beautiful bridge and tunnel that links Copenhagen to, or Denmark anyway, to Sweden. The engineers for that company, for that enterprise, for that project, Arup, they've been employee-owned for nearly 50 years now. And so in all these cases, you can see the quality. The retailer that one of you mentioned, Publix in America, which is the top-rated retailer by its customers in all of America. And also it's in the Forbes best places to work. Every single time that list has been published by Forbes, this has been prominent in it. And it's called Publix. It's got 183,000 employees. That has been employee-owned since shortly after the war. So again and again you find the best. The really good companies are long-term employee-owned companies. And as well as this enormously successful competitive economic performance, they are a marvelous place for human beings to live in because of the sharing of everything, the information, the consultation, the voting, the actual power. The choice of the top person is in the employee hands, and so you know that you count. And because you count, you're treated with respect. And that is just a superb place to work, which is why the Italian numbers show that people live longer. So if you want to get into an employee-owned company, however you do it, and you will live longer and be happier.
Thank you. And that comes from a man who has a PhD in the psychology of sharing. So he knows what he's talking about and has also run one of these firms himself. I think we will end at that note. Thank you so much to all our speakers today, especially to you, David Ellerman. Thank you so much to Kalle Mone for coming in. And I think we have a big challenge now that these international guys are leaving, to continue talking about this here in Norway. So hopefully we can cooperate more on that. And please, Rethinking Economics Norway, we are generally just trying to lift up new economic ideas, new economic debates. Please give us some support. There's a little note here. You can have some information about how you can become a member, be on our email list, give us some money. We need this. We can continue to do these kind of events. So thank you so much.